Imagine you've never seen these things before, tefillin or phylacteries in Greek. How strange they must look. I was once on a British Airlines flight and a lady came up to me, not a member of the tribe. She saw that I had my yid lid on and she said to me, my kippah, and said, I saw Rabbi, meaning a Jew with a beard, in front of the aeroplane and he had leather straps on his arms and a transistor radio in his head. And that's how strange they must look. So the question is, how do we know? Why is it that observant Jews around the world for millennia have been putting on straps with boxes? How do we even know what we're wearing? How do we know what they are? All the Bible says, the Torah, is very simple. It says, V'shinamtan levanecha, you should teach it to your children, and Ukshautam liot al yadecha, v'hayu l'totafot bein yinecha. You should put them as a sign on your arm, and they should be as frontlets between your eyes. But how do you know what they is? How do you know it's a black box? How do you know it's black straps? How do you know it makes a design? And that, my friends, is because in addition to the written Torah, we also have an oral Torah, Torah Sheba'al Peh, that explains this. Next question is, how do we know what we're wearing today are the same tefillin that Jews wore 2,000 years ago? How do we know we have that link of Jewish continuity going on? And the answer is, till the late 1950s, we didn't know. We just assumed that's our tradition. And yet, what happened in this very spot changed our perception of tefillin. In the late 1950s, Yigal Yadin, who shot to fame a few years later in the early 60s when he excavated Masada, was digging here in Qumran, where we are right now, the site of the Essene community, the site of where the caves down here where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, and up there, and he was looking for more Dead Sea Scrolls. In fact, there was a race. He was one of many teams scouring the caves of the Judean desert looking for Dead Sea Scrolls. Instead, what he found in a cave in Qumran was not Dead Sea Scrolls, but remains of a slightly later period, the time of the Bar Kokhba revolt. He found remains of Jews and their possessions from the 2nd century CE, the second great revolt against the Romans in the land of Israel. So the question is, what would you take with you if you were fleeing from a massive Roman force? What vital possessions would you take with you? Some people have taken legal documents with them. And he found some unusual things that you wouldn't expect people to grab when they're fleeing for their lives. One of the unusual things he found, which always amuses me, was he found one of the women had taken her entire makeup kit with. Eyeliner, perfume bottles, everything, because you got to look beautiful in a cave. And very poignantly, he also found a very small pair of tefillin, just like this. In fact, these were the oldest tefillin in the world, all the way from the time of the Mishnah, from the 2nd century. And because it's so dry out here in the desert, organic material that normally rots was perfectly preserved. Leather, parchment, sandals, wicker baskets, all this stuff was perfectly preserved. Now, these tefillin were so small that he couldn't actually read them. He was curious to know, do we still have the same scrolls inside our tefillin that they used back then 2,000 years ago? So he took the tefillin, he packed them up, took them into a box and went on a train from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv to the police lab there where you could do infrared photographs and to enlarge the parchment to see if it's the same tefillin. And he wasn't an observant man. He was sitting on the train and a young Chabad Chassid was going around asking people if they put on their tefillin. You sometimes see them in New York, you see them at the Western Wall, all over the place. And he didn't normally put on tefillin. But he heard this guy had a strange accent. He said to him, hey, where are you from? He said, I'm from the Soviet Union. And Yigal Yadin said, well, tell me, did you put on tefillin when you were in the Soviet Union? And the guy said, actually, yes, I did. And Yigal Yadin said, what would have happened if the authorities would have caught you? He said, well, I might have been put in prison or sent to Gulag, because it's forbidden to practice our religion openly. And Yadin said to him, after thinking, he said, listen, I don't normally put on tefillin, but out of respect of your bravery, the fact that you put them on the Soviet Union, I'll put on tefillin today for you. And he put on the tefillin, took them off, didn't think anything about it. As the train's putting into Tel Aviv, there was a woman who'd been watching this whole exchange sitting in the compartment, and she went up to him and said, Professor Yadin, that guy didn't know who you are. I do. I know you're a famous archaeologist, I know you're a former chief of staff of the IDF, and I also know that you're a secular Jew. And when you put on those tefillin, it meant a lot to me, and I'd like to tell you why. Years later, he recorded this in his diary, this exchange, and he didn't quite know how to respond. He said, okay. And she said, listen, in 1956, just a few years ago, my husband was the only religious soldier in his paratrooper unit in the Sinai War, in the Sinai campaign. And there was an Egyptian machine gun nest threatening all of the soldiers, and he went up and single-handedly took it out, but he was mortally wounded. And as he lay dying, he said to his secular comrades, one wish, and they told me this at the Shiva house, one thing I'd like you to do for me, and that's to put on tefillin in my memory. And they told me this story at the Shiva house. And when I saw you today putting on this tefillin, it reminded me of my late husband and his last wish. And Nigal Yadin, who was an academic and not known for his emotional outbursts, was deeply moved. He said to the woman, thank you for sharing your story and thank you for your husband's bravery. And I think you should be the one to see what I have in this bag. And he opened his bag, took out the box and said, this is the oldest pair of tefillin in the world. And showed her the tefillin that he just found in Qumran a few days earlier. And we are all now, every single morning when I put these tefillin on, I think I am part of that chain of Jewish continuity stretching all the way back to when we were free and independent in our land, back to when we are again free and independent in our land. As if that pair of tefillin had been waiting for 2,000 years for a general of the new Jewish army to come back and say, Am Yisrael Chai, the people of Israel live, because we follow our traditions, our community, and of our attachment to the land of Israel.